It's Patrick Christie tonight. We're only on GBNews. My press pack returns with the first of tonight's front pages, which will include, I imagine, a serving government minister resigning because of the threats that they feel over the Israel-Palestine situation. We cannot have serving politicians resigning, feeling as though they can't do their job because of violent threats and thuggery on the streets of Britain. But first, we cover the latest twists in the absolutely massive Martin Bashir scandal in our Royal Dispatch. So the latest documents released by the BBC have shown that Bashir himself claimed to be a victim of racism inside the BBC when confronted with allegations over his infamous 1995 Panorama interview with Princess Diana. Writing to a BBC historian back in 2020, Bashir said that professional jealousy caused by a second-generation immigrant of non-white working-class roots, the temerity to enter a royal palace, may have fuelled the investigation into him, adding that it would have been so much easier if one of the dynastic Dimbleby brothers had secured the scoop instead. Convenient, perhaps, that Bashir decided to play this race card in July 2020, just 2 months after George Floyd's death whipped up the Western world into a race-fuelled hysteria. Earlier today, I spoke to Mark Killick. Now, Mark lost his job as a Panorama producer with the BBC for raising his own concerns about this exact issue. He tried to blow the lid off the Bashir scandal all those years ago. Mark, Martin Bashir clearly decided that this wasn't a particular scandal that warranted investigation and that he felt as though his race and professional jealousy was playing a part in blowing this thing up to being a much bigger thing than it actually was. What do you make of that?
Well, my understanding is that was from an email from 2020 before Lord Dyson's report. I think Lord Dyson's report blows that defence out of the water. He makes it very clear that Martin Bashir was a dishonest reporter and the things that Martin did were pretty reprehensible. But what I think's as interesting is the new emails that are coming out are going to throw a new light on the new management, and that will genuinely be interesting to see.
Can you expand a bit on that for me, please? So we are in a situation where things are being redacted, where there is obviously a massive pushback at the BBC and a huge reluctance at the BBC to have all of this information out there. Why do you think they are so concerned?
Because the BBC, I think, from the start has tried to control the narrative of this story. I think they're very happy that the focus of the Dyson report was on Martin Bashir. They're a lot less happy when it's on the senior management of the BBC. What these emails are all about are what the senior management of the BBC did, what they thought, and what I think will come through. And obviously, we haven't seen them in full yet, but what I think will come through is the BBC trying to control the narrative, potentially trying to manipulate what comes out and what doesn't come out.
And you think that there is a possibility that that could lead back to very senior levels at the BBC right now?
Well, I think there's no question that it could. I mean, one of the things that generated this Freedom of Information Act request was the suggestion that a report wrongly implicating Lord Spencer had been put in the public domain. Why was that? Why was that one report, not all the others, put out there in advance? That's a question. It could have been coincidence or it could be conspiracy. We'll understand more when we look at these 3,000 emails. I think the issue we've got, that 3,000 emails, whilst it's a lot over a 2-month period, probably doesn't reveal the full picture. And I suspect the BBC have opened Pandora's box now, and eventually all the documentation surrounding the BBC thinking, both originally and now, will come out.
Do you think they should just bite the bullet and do that? Because there's going to be immense pressure here for them to do it. I don't think the public are going to accept this slow drip, drip, drip of redacted information. Should they just bite the bullet, fess up, be upfront with us now and do it and just face the consequences?
I think that's absolutely right. The trouble with this drip, drip, drip is you're not getting the full disclosure that the BBC claim. The BBC claim they want the full picture.
The BBC is an iconic institution, OK? How damaging to its reputation could this be?
Well, I think you've got to accept that the BBC, in instructing Dyson to do the report, did itself a lot of good. But there is other things to come out. I mean, we do know this attempt to try and control the narrative, the bringing out the email referencing Lord Spencer and wrongly suggesting he might have been implicated in some of this stuff. There's also the more recent things that have come out which suggest it's a much closer relationship between Mr. Bashir and the BBC more recently than the BBC have said. The BBC have said he was too ill to talk, but they're clearly corresponding with him almost daily. All this stuff, it's both small and larger, and I suspect it won't do the BBC an awful lot of good that it comes out, but it probably is right that it comes out.
Yeah, I mean, that implication there at the end, I think, is actually quite important, isn't it? Which is that, are they actually still kind of working together to try to do damage limitation on both parts for their own mutual benefit? And just to clarify then, how important was the initial scandal that happened here? I mean, it had big consequences for the royal family. It had big consequences for Britain. Some people have gone on and said, it's potentially in some way contributed towards both Diana's death and also the relationship that both princes went on to have with the British media, probably played out more egregiously with Prince Harry than William, let's be honest. Would you go as far as to say that there was an initial level of deceit and deception there that has had those kind of far-reaching consequences for this country?
No, I think it has. I think Diana was a vulnerable person despite her fame and her celebrity. And I think she was destabilised by the lies she was told, by the destruction it did to her court. And I think the princes, and the reason why they spoke out together and felt so strongly about it, because they recognise the damage that was done. So, I mean, it was a huge scoop and it was a terrible scandal.
A terrible scandal that could go right to the very top. But let's get the thoughts of my panel now. Editor-at-large at the Mail on Sunday, Charlotte Griffiths, businessman and activist Adam Brooks, and author and journalist Rebecca Reid. Look, Charlotte, I'll go to you on this. You're not afraid of a royal scoop yourself, of course. What do you make of this Bashir thing now? I mean, how high do you think this could go? What's your take on it?
Well, I think playing the race card is going to cause him a lot of problems. I bet he's weathered many a problem over the last few years. I think he's right to say, if only Jonathan or David Dimbleby had done this interview. The reason is because the Dimbleby brothers are proper journalists that don't con their way into interviews. So I think he's kind of right, but I don't think it's to do with race. I think it's to do with his skill set as a journalist, which, frankly, is very much up for debate.
The timing of it is quite interesting, Adam. Potentially some insinuation, maybe, that is jumping on the old George Floyd bandwagon at that particular moment in time. This is pretty scandalous, though, really. And again, the BBC, I think, should really fess up to everything here now. There's supposedly going to be a very slow drip of emails. Just get it all out there. Pandora's box, as you were hearing there, from the bloke who tried to blow the lid off this thing years ago, is now open.
Look, do I think if Martin Bashir was a white man, he still would have got a lot of heat and a lot of pushback? Yes, I do. I don't see any race sort of involved in this, and I think he is playing the race card, and it's a bad look. I agree. He's also playing the class snobbery
card as well, saying because he's not posh, but I just don't think that applies either, to be honest.
Oh, I think it does.
No, she's a national icon. Anyone was going to get... With these revelations coming out, anyone was going to get...
it was found to have basically consequences.
Totally, and I think we all agree with that. But two things. Number one, this woman has been dead for a very, very long time. I'm not really sure who it's helping to start dragging this all back up and going over and over it again.
In some quarters, Rebecca, this interview, some people do blame on aspects that led up to her death.
That's ridiculous. Not wearing a seatbelt was largely what led to her death. This is so silly. It's a waste of time and money. Everybody knows it's badly handled. He is not still doing the same thing again and again. The BBC is a different organisation. Most people who work there don't work there anymore.
But the BBC isn't a different organisation. It's just redacted all the documents.
But most of the people...
It's no better than it was in 1995.
But nobody who was involved in this is still making these decisions or still working there now. There's a huge turnover of people. This is 20-something years ago.
Do you think his skin colour has played a part in this?
So
yes or no?
His full, long quote, he says that he thinks that professional jealousy and we all know journalists are awful. And as in, he thinks that he was a victim of professional jealousy, which is definitely true because journalists are dreadful, and classism, which is definitely real, and racism, and a lot of other things.
Yeah, but
and I think those probably all do.
Yeah, but those things might exist.
But
in
two
this
things.
case, he lied his way into it.
But two things can be true at the same time. You can both be held to a slightly higher standard because you're a working class man, and also have done something wrong.
It's a real shame, that isn't it, that those people who might have prejudiced against him actually turned out, to also have this cast iron guarantee that this guy essentially lied his way into it. I mean, you want to push back on anything that Rebecca said?
Yeah, I do. I also push back on this thing that it's not current or relevant now. I honestly think Prince William would say it's totally relevant now. His whole life has been changed to this very moment.
But I don't...
But we shouldn't let this argument with Prince Harry, because his whole life was changed by this terrible ordeal that his parents went through because of lies and distrust amongst his family.
That marriage was already completely torn apart.
The divorce was affected by this bashing.
Oh, come on! You think they would have stayed married if this interview hadn't happened?
He also said
he'd been sleeping with somebody else for years.
One at a time. OK, well, or no one at a time now. There we go. I do have a statement from the BBC. They said, throughout this process, we have taken our responsibilities to comply with the directions of the tribunal extremely seriously. Therefore, we've today released approximately 3,000 documents, some 10,000 pages to Mr Webb. We've made redactions where necessary, consistent with the Freedom of Information Act. There is nothing to support allegations that the BBC acted in bad faith in 2020. We maintain that this suggestion is simply wrong.